Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome once again to another live event of the Fountain Magazine. Today, we have four very esteemed speakers from different corners of the world who will be moderated by, again, very esteemed friends and contributors to the Fountain Magazine. We will have speakers from India, from Austria, from England, all the way to LA. So I hope we will have some friendly conversations. Before we start, again, I wish everyone that you're all safe. I really hope under the pandemic conditions, you yourselves and your beloved ones are doing well, protected from the pandemic and other misfortunes that may come in your way. Here in New Jersey, we're having pretty hot summer days, which have started in the recent weeks. But hopefully during these pandemic days, maybe you will enjoy this conversation, which will cover very different topics, starting from our biological makeup to the society and how they respond to the COVID pandemic. And we're going a little back into history to explore how the Orientalists traveled in the Middle East and in the Far East and observe the world there. So before I don't want to delay the conversation. So our first speaker will be Jada Sablak, who's a medical student. She'll be moderated by Jamal Özgür, my colleague from the Fountain office. Let me introduce Jamal very briefly. He's the outreach coordinator for the Fountain magazine. He graduated from Boston College in 2017 with a degree in political science and afterwards interned for Congress and worked with nonprofits in Washington, D.C. He's interested in and writes about consumer social media habits, social sciences, justice, human rights, and government. Again, just to remind, we are now reviewing our latest issue, the Fountain Magazine 135th, and I hope you'll enjoy the conversation. So, Jamal, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hakan. So without further ado, let's get our first interview underway. We have Jada Sablak, who graduated with a major in biology from Elizabethtown College and is currently a medical student at the University of South Florida, and is the author of the article Maintaining the Brain, Neurons That Fire Together, Wire Together from our latest issue 135. And thank you so much for joining us today, Jada.
Thank you for the kind introduction.
Let's get right into it. We got three questions. The first question is, in your article is about human brains and how we sort of biologically develop habits. And a term that you mention a lot is long-term potentiation, or LTP. Could you please explain what LTP is and why it's so important?
Sure. So long-term potentiation is a fairly new concept in science, and it's what we found explains how learning happens and how memory happens. It's been known that neurons don't multiply, so one neuron never turns into two neurons. But the study of long-term potentiation has shown that neurons do change. They can grow and they can shrink. So when they shrink, we actually call that long-term depression. So the mnemonic for that is, if you don't use it, you lose it. Whereas long-term potentiation is, like you said, neurons that fire together, wire together. So the biology behind this has a lot to do with different channels and ions, and I'm not going to get too much into that. You can read more about that in the article. But basically why this matters is not only our memory and learning, but also it explains the kind of pathways that we build and the type of with our default pathways, then we can also explain why biological things are happening in our body as well. So if someone's
it's really about strengthening what we have in our brain. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, no,
it's really about strengthening what we have. And instead of because obviously we can't multiply in our brains. So it's more about strengthening our current systems.
Exactly. Building new systems and things like that. So it was first discovered while understanding how learning happens, but more research has actually shown how important it is in overall health as well. So people who are more stressed tend to have those pathways more active in their brains. Those are their default pathways. So if you're more likely to be an angry person, then you're more likely to have higher blood pressure. If you have higher blood pressure, you're more likely to have heart disease, things like this. So if you can kind of take a step back and rebuild your pathways and modify your pathways to become a calmer, happier person, then you can actually increase the longevity of your life as well.
That's a very big impact. It has, it seems like it has a lot of effects on our overall health as well, besides just mental. You also discuss prayer, spirituality, and tranquility in relation to LTP. So what's the connection? You mentioned briefly, like having a calmer life does have impact. So what's the connection between kind of spirituality, calmness, and LTP?
Of course. So basically long-term potentiation, we said neurons that fire together, wire together. So whichever ones you're using more, those are the ones that are getting strengthened. So with prayer, there is really an element of repetition, regardless of whichever faith background you come from. Either you go to, church weekly or you're Muslim and you pray 5 times a day. There is that element of repetition. And I really thought John Paul put it very nicely, where he said, personally, prayer builds confidence. Culturally, prayer builds trust, and socially, prayer builds movements. And it's not that prayer is particularly political or miraculous. It's just that this repetition of prayer comforts your mind with the solace of the familiar. So because every time you come to it, you're like, oh, this is a feeling that I have already experienced before, that makes you feel better about yourself. And I mean, prayer kind of also relates directly to cognitive behavioral therapy, in my opinion, where psychologists will tell their patients to keep a gratitude journal. So you're consciously thinking of 3 things that you're grateful for every day, and that is actually rewiring your brain to be a more positive person.
I've heard of that too, of therapists recommending calmness and gratefulness and gratitude to really help calm people down. So it seems like really that tranquility and spirituality are ways to kind of wire your brains, your LTPs, to accept a more calming and relaxed lifestyle. I think, is that a good way to summarize it, basically?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. And lastly, at the end of the article, you discussed the broader implications of LTP and how it actually not just affects yourself, but affects people around you. I think that has a lot of broader implications for society. So why don't you talk about that a bit more?
Sure. So again, another fairly new topic, again, when I say new, last 10, 20 years, in psychology is mirror neurons. So this was like first observed in monkeys where one of them would show one emotion, the other one would copy them. And we've seen that in humans as well, where, you've probably experienced it yourself. When a friend is smiling, you smile with them, or if your friend is crying, you cry with them. So this is mirror neurons. And again, it actually goes back to that John Paul quote, where if you are personally improving yourself and personally rewiring your own brain, you can be that positive person. You can be that mirror to people around you. And if everyone is working on themselves in a way that makes them more positive and calmer people, then society as a whole will become calmer and more peaceful. Yeah.
No, it makes sense, because I mean, like, it's hard to be happy around other people that are always miserable or upset, and it's much more difficult to be upset when you're always around positive people. It definitely does rub off on you.
Mm-hmm.
So sounds like really is the biological explanation of that.
Yeah, I guess it's also about like finding that balance between training yourself to be that person, but also surrounding yourself with the right people. You can't always control who's around you. I think it's also important to surround yourself with people maybe who don't make you feel as good all the time, because that's how social change happens. But it's definitely a multi-pronged thing where you have to kind of work on yourself, but also recognize that it has broader implications as well.
I think this article is very inspiring because it does teach that we have the power really to kind of change the way our brains are wired. Maybe we accept that we're the way we are because that's just how things kind of are. I'm just this kind of person, but it seems like through understanding LTP and the science behind it, we can really rewire our brains, as you mentioned. That seems like the real power behind it.
For sure. And like, it's not mentioned in the article, but plasticity does decrease with age, but it never completely goes away. So you always have the option to, work on your brain cells and making them and transforming them into what you want them to be.
Okay, so it's a very interesting article. I would encourage everyone to read it. Do you have any, you want to close with anything, or should we move on to the next discussion?
I think we can move on. Thank you.
Okay, awesome, great discussion. Let's turn over now to Behzad Fatmi, who will introduce our next speaker and article.
Hello, good evening. Thank you, Mr. Hakan Yeshilova, for giving me this opportunity to interview Professor Anwar Alam today. Thank you, Professor Anwar Alam, for joining us. I will be interviewing you about your latest article for the Fountain magazine. Professor Anwar Alam is a senior fellow with Policy Perspectives Foundation, New Delhi, and the director of Institute of Dialogue Studies in Dialogue Foundation. Earlier, he served as the Professor of International Relations at Zirve University, Gaziantep, Turkey, and Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, Director of Center for West Asian Studies, Jamia Millia Islamia, and Associate Professor at School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He is a recipient of the prestigious Alexander von Humboldt Postdoctoral Research Fellowship, Germany, and specializes in West Asian and South Asian studies. Welcome, Professor Alam.
Thank you, Bezir.
So in your latest article for the Fountain magazine, you talked about religious communities and responses to COVID-19, the case of Hizmet Movement you talked about in particular. So may I begin with requesting you to give a highlight or brief of the article that you wrote?
Let me first confess that because this article also has the input given by Hakan Bey, who is here at the moment. So I must acknowledge his input, very humbly, actually. The way I wrote this article and his input were very crucial in reformulating some of the positions. And I'm thankful for getting published in the Fountain, in fact. When I have conceived this article, I had basically conceived in the context of the emerging controversy in India, actually, where we have this very powerful Islamic movement of Tablighi Jamaat, and they had the religious, congregations. And therefore, the kind of, for example, the politics of polarization that is going on at the moment. So particularly community and particularly organizations and particularly the Muslim community has been blamed for the spread of this virus, actually. And that's how it begins, actually, So the idea was that let's find out that, it is merely the whole Islamic or a Muslim community, or how other religious groups and the religious organizations, globally has responded to this pandemic, actually. And then you get to know the very interesting facts, actually. And the fact is that the American society itself is socially conservative, and therefore the law cannot close down many of the churches and many of the denominations. So the congregation is also there, Now the whole idea that the idea of gathering itself is very religious. It's extremely problematic propositions for me. And then you went on to find on actually the how, for example, the quiz and for example, particular resort or particular travel tourist, how that has become the center of the spread of this virus, in major part of the Western Europe, and therefore probably this whole idea of the singling out of a particular community, which was not only deeply problematic, but I also found it extremely brutal, actually. Not brutal in the physical sense of the term, but brutal in the sense of the cognitive, the way the ideas basically moved and hurts other sentiments. That's how this article came,
actually. Thank you. So in this article, you of course talk about how the Hizmet movement has responded to this global pandemic, and how the leader of the movement, Mr. Fethullah Gulen, is asking his followers to help people who are in trouble, who are facing difficulties because of this. So how do you think the Hizmet movement is different from other religious organizations or faith-based organizations, not only in Islam, but also other from other religions?
I mean, well, first I try to find out what are the statements that has been issued by the many Islamic movements. And no matter what terminology basically we used as a kind of the civic social, as far as the Gulen movement is concerned, I personally believe that it is a religious social movement actually. It is not typically civic social, you know, that in the ultimate analysis that it is the Islamic ethos and the Islamic traditions and the Islamic scriptures that basically constitute the source of inspiration for this movement actually. So I first tried to really check out some of these statements on the waves, and I found out that some of the important Islamic seminaries in India, like for example Deoband, which Bejas probably you know that, or like for example some of Jamaat Ulama Hind and many others actually, they even did not come out with any kind of the statement appealing to their own community how to behave or probably how to maintain the physical distance or a social distance actually, or even how to adopt a scientific pro-medical approach in dealing with such kind of the pandemic crisis actually. And therefore these questions actually emerge that the Hizmet movement or the Gulen movement, which is basically global in scope, how it has really responded to this phenomenon actually. And there was two way of looking at. One is basically also to go just if there is any statement or a formal statement that has been issued by Fatehullah Gulen, or the other could be is that how the everyday practices of the Hizmet movement has responded to this crisis actually. And to be very honest, I was really amazed to find out the formal statement by Fatehullah Gulen, because if you look at the statement in very details actually, what is really very important is that there is a very fundamental assumption in that statement, and that fundamental assumption is that that the preservation of life is the motto of any religion or probably any law, whether it's religious law or a secular law. This whole idea of the preservation of law, the preservation of life. And therefore what you find very interestingly is that in that formal statement it says that Gulen is taking a position that given these challenges of the pandemic COVID-19, one has to really take into the consideration of all the medical sciences and the medical innovation that so far that has really taken place, and that must be accommodated actually, and that must be incorporated in order to address to this actually. Now here what I see is that for the first time the whole idea of any kind of opposition between religion and the science actually breaks down actually. That religion does not appear as a kind of the alien zone for large number of people with a scientific mentor, scientific temper, scientific attitudes, the kind of the gap, because Gulen has not taken a position that simply you go back to Quran and go back to Hadith and go back to the Sunnah and the problem will be over actually. And he could not take that simple the way it has been in a very conservative, in a very socially orthodox kind of position that you take, is that certainly the faith is basically supreme, there's no doubt actually. But the whole idea that he has is a human-centered Islamic theology actually. How to make theology and everyday real practices which actually serve or contribute to the living purposes, And that you find very importantly is that his whole idea of probably the human being as the inheritors of the earth actually, that ultimately connects with that in fact, And that's how I find that the statement and the entire practices of the Gulen movement in dealing, which basically imposes self-disciplining and as well as a solution providing approach, I find it fantastic in the movement, which probably I have really not come across in many of the other religious movements, whether of the Islamic variety or probably some of the Hindu movement in India, which I am aware of that. Yeah.
Sure. And we all know that you have also published a book on the Hizmet movement, For the Sake of Allah, in which you talk about the Hizmet's approach towards dialogue, towards education, towards relief work, and others. But in your research, post your research, which was related to that book, have the response to this global pandemic that the Hizmet movement has shown, do you find anything surprising in the way the movement has responded to this pandemic?
No,
Or
in a sense, I think that, for example, for me, this is very important because one is that the dialogue is at the center of this movement, actually. And somehow that in this Hizmet movement, the dialogue has been reduced to the whole idea of the interfaith dialogue, which I have a very limited understanding of dialogue in that form, which I do not see that that's how the Hizmet basically operates, actually. But I do see at a much more ontological level that where Fatehullah Gulen is basically speaking, like for example, pandemic COVID-19, or for example, any kinds of the problem actually. It is also probably a reaction of the nature to the entire discourse of modernity as such. Will there be a genuine dialogue takes place between the nature and the modernity itself? Will there be a dialogue take place between the human beings and the ecology? Will a genuine dialogue, what about the dialogue is not merely among the individuals. This whole idea that the 2 and 3 and 4 individuals, I don't think that Fatehullah Gulen has approached the idea of dialogue this way. He's talking about a dialogue probably between also the human beings and probably much more higher self actually, because there's a multiple kinds of the accountability that exist between the human beings and God. There is not one, multiple layers of the accountability. And therefore, what I find very interestingly in the Hizmet movement, as it has been propounded by Fatehullah Gulen, is that it is just not merely the question of the interfaith dialogue, but probably how are you going to ensure your dialogue in a very diverse in the plural way, which is not merely the question of intercultural or intergender or international or interfaith, but it is also the question of a cultural conception of geography, which is also the question, the cultural conception of religion, which is also the question, the cultural conception of nature. For example, I can give you the way the Hindu understanding of the water is completely different. I do not know how the cultural understanding of the water in the West, or in the Islamic imagination or the Buddhist imagination, but I can tell you that the water is something very sacred as far as the Hindu imagination is concerned, actually. And the water is deeply integrated with the whole idea of the environment, actually. If you look at on that plane, actually, I think it's that dialogue also a very important role has to play in basically responding to this COVID issue, actually. How are you responding to that, actually? You're not responding only in a mechanical way, actually. You're also responding in harmony with the larger environment, larger ecology. Only then probably any kind of the social medicine could become very effective. And that's where I find the essence of the Gulen movement. Yeah.
thank you. And my final question, you identified some problems with the religious organizations with regards to their resistance to medical treatment. You talked about how religious organizations previously too resisted medical science during pandemic. But at the same time, it is also a fact that the scientists, people who believe in science, they also feel they are superior to those who are religious. So they see science as having superiority over religion. So of course, it is important that the religious organizations and clergy understand that science is complementary with their religions. But at the same time, it is important for the scientists to understand that religion is not always harmful for their agenda. It is not conflicting with science. So this is also, I think, is important, and the scientists too need to acknowledge the importance of religion, especially in countries like India.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I think is that vertical demarcation between religion and science probably belong to the West, not to the East, actually. That kind of the vertical demarcation that you see between religion and the West and the science, that happened because of the particular kind of the role that was played by the church, actually. And therefore probably the kind of the secular philosophy that basically emerged in the West, which was basically anti-clericalism. You do not have that kind of considerations here, actually. And therefore, what you find very interestingly in India and probably the other parts is that most of the scientists are deeply religious, not only in their private life, but also in a public life, because they have not maintained any kind of the demarcation between the two, actually, So that entire methods of this conflict between the religion and science somehow it got universalized, and it got really basically universalized because of the dominance of the written language and because of the dominance of the production of the narratives that basically emerge in the West, actually, But otherwise, in terms of culture and the everyday practices, we do not have that kind of the very rigid demarcations, actually, and therefore you do not find that kind of debates also taking place here, in fact, that's typically that happened there. I mean, that's what I feel. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Anwar Alam, for
Thank
this
you, Beza. Thank you so much.
Conversation, and I strongly recommend your article to our audience tonight. And if you want to deliver any concluding remarks, you are most welcome to do that. Otherwise, we'll go ahead.
That's fine. That's fine. Thank you so much.
So may I now hand over the floor to Mehmet Gökçel for the next conversation.
Before we go to Mehmet, let me introduce very briefly Behzat, who moderated this session. I'm very grateful to you and to Professor Alam. It's 2:30 or 3 a.m. in India right now, so we kept you up awake. Apologies for that, but I really thought your contribution to this conversation would be very beneficial. So Behzat Fetmi is a dear friend, but he's also the Secretary General of Delhi-based Hizmet-affiliated International Peace and Dialogue Organization, In Dialogue Foundation. He's also a non-residential research fellow at London-based think tank Turkey Institute. Apart from being a full-time dialogue practitioner, he writes widely in the Indian and international media, mainly on Turkish politics. He's also a YouTuber, and my sons want to be like him, a YouTuber. That's their career plan for future. And he makes informative videos on Turkish politics in the Hindustani language. He holds a master's degree in dialogue studies from Keele University, UK. For those who did not have a copy, this was the book by Professor Anwar Alam. I think this is one of the best books on the Gülen movement for those who are interested in social studies, social movements, faith-based movements, especially those inspired by Islam. I think this is the book to go as a main source of understanding where these movements stay, and as opposed to the Gülen movement. I think this is a real book that I was very happy to be a part of as well in its editorial process. I'm very grateful to Professor Alam for allowing me to be a part of it. So again, thanks to India. So if you could stay a bit longer, maybe we may have questions at the very end.
As per your command, Hakan Bey, I'm here.
All right, thank you very much. So our next speaker is Lawrence Brazier. He's a British living in Austria. So I thought that a best moderator for him would be another British who's in London, but who's also a historian like him. So let me introduce the moderator, a dear friend, a contributor to the Fountain too. Mehmet Gökçel works as a mentoring supervisor for Mentor Wise, a London-based charity dedicated to support youth in Britain. He's a graduate of history and politics and holds an MA in history of political thought and intellectual history from University College London. Mehmet has a research interest in the political ideas of the Enlightenment, as well as contemporary political thought ranging from nationalism, republicanism, and popular sovereignty. Well, I look forward to the discussions. The floor is yours, Mehmet.
Thank you, Hakan, for the kind introduction. I'm actually honored to be having this conversation with Mr. Lawrence Brazier. I will briefly introduce him and then move on to my questions about his very fascinating article. Lawrence Brazier was born in Oxford in England. He is married and has 4 children with his wife Romana, and now lives in Austria. He's a German-English translator and journalist, and he's published in, apart from the Fountain, he's published in the Interreligious Insight, World Journal of Faith, Crisis Magazine, Church Times, and The Wanderer. plus many other publications to other themes, including politics, memoir, travel, and travel humor. He is interested in metaphysical matters and Oriental ceramics. Lawrence and his wife translate voluntary texts from German for diverse third world agencies. Well, before we kick off the discussion, I want to quickly, briefly share my thoughts on the article. I thought it was fascinating, to say the least, and I'm glad that it's titled "The Orientalists Part 1." So I am looking forward to the next parts to be published in Fountain magazine, and we will be discussing further on the content, but essentially the travel rights of Orientalists from the 19th century and even earlier have always been a topic of fascination for the whole world, really. But I'd like to ask, to begin with, I'd like to ask Lawrence what your goal was in writing this piece.
Well, thank you, Mehmet. Well, I've made some notes, and as I've written down here, the writing was all too simple. I like the Fountain magazine, and there's a Muslim readership, so that was pretty logical. And I'm also interested in the Muslim world, in Islam, and I stopped reading novels years ago, and that meant travel literature, and it also meant creative nonfiction, and I've got this a bit further back in my notes, but listening to the lady who spoke at the very beginning, and there was something very interesting. I was been rereading Robert Ardrey, and he wrote a book called African Genesis and 3 other books that followed on. And he didn't get into metaphysics. He didn't go back that far. He just sort of got the cradle of humanity was in Africa. But the development of humankind and what the lady was talking about, rewiring the brain and that kind of thing, was very, very interesting. I found it fascinating. And I think she's probably onto something there. It sounds like she's hitting the right note, because why we are the way we are is kind of fascinating, and what makes us like the way we are. What made Sir Richard Burton go traveling? My idea is that he just wanted to get out, he just wanted to get away. He loved holidays. It was pretty banal, actually. He just wanted to escape dreary old Britain on a rainy Sunday. He just wanted to travel, and he was fascinated by the exotic Orient, just as I am, just as I think possibly all of us are, one way or another. And to write this article was actually pretty easy for me, because I've got literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books in our house. We use them for insulation against the cold weather, on the walls. They're all round everywhere. And I've just read everything that I can lay my hands on over the years. My wife despairs at the amount of money I spend on books, But I think basically the idea of writing about the Orientalists, and I'm interested in why people do what they do, and that sort of links in with that lady at the beginning who spoke. And why are we so inclined? Somebody mentioned from a religious aspect that when Allah decides, he just sort of pulls his finger and he says, you're my guy, you're with me. He decides. And I wonder, what is the deciding factor for different kinds of people? What is the deciding factor for all of you academics? Why did you go in for it? What made it interesting for you? What was your motivating? What was the impetus? The basic drive, where does it come from? And I found that this basic drive is, as Muhammad would have it, is God. And I think without God, nobody does anything, And I would even go as far as to say that an atheist even needs God to be able to deny God. Without God, an atheist can't speak. So that's where I'm at as far as the religious, respectively the spiritual aspect of everything.
Yeah.
That Richard Burton. T. Lawrence was a very complex man. He was a sort of a guy who wanted to find some reason to be, I think. He was an existentialist, And you mentioned Albert Camus in The Only Thing I'm Interested In Is to Find Inner Peace. And I got a feeling that this inner peace is where spirituality comes in. Again, this links with the lady at the beginning. I was quite taken by her mention, what she was talking about. And the feeling that everybody approaches it different. She seems to have gone on an academic route, but so what? It's okay. God likes science, and he invented it, And the travelers, why did they go? Why did they do it? Well, I think they needed diversion from the harshness of everyday life.
Yeah.
I hate to say this, but I think most of us do. Does that sort of make any sense to you people? I don't know.
Yes, and it doesn't. I don't think the readers were meant to be given a historical account, like accurate account of exactly what happened and what followed, what were the causes, etc. This has a lot of feeling to it, this article, and a lot of it is to do with discovering that spark inside of these travelers, to see what really inspired them to do what they did.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like,
excuse me. Yeah. I wanted to say it's like music, you get the classical hair raising on the back of your head when it's really great music.
Yeah.
To find that kind of inner response to literature or to writing is really, really hard. Mm-hmm. Somebody's got to be really good to be able to put onto paper something that is equal to what Mozart did. You listen to a few bars of Mozart or Bach or the others, and this is from heaven, this is heaven, and you get that special feeling, when you're listening to something great. Now, for a writer to achieve that is really, really difficult, and I found very, very few. Like I said, I've read hundreds, thousands of books possibly, but it's very, very rare to find that kind of quality in the written word. Mm-hmm. George Bernard Shaw was pretty good, he was okay, but he made people laugh too. And I recently had a quote from a mystic that I found was interesting. He said that when you laugh, a belly laugh, you can't think at the same time. Try it, try laughing and thinking. It doesn't work, it's difficult, So these things, and some of the early mystic, like Sheikh Jilani, I purchased a book by him called The Removal of Cares. What a absolutely fascinating title. I've got to have that. If that works, I've got to read it, And The Removal of Cares, I was looking for something mystic, but it wasn't. The first discourse said, "Young man, are you envious?" And I thought, wow, wait a minute, we're talking ordinary psychology here. And those were and I did find over the years, because I'm getting on now, I'm getting old, but over the years, I did find that a lot of it is so awfully simple. Mm-hmm. It isn't complicated,
And from these travelers, some of the quotations that you've provided, to show their motivation for traveling and for reading and for studying, for being curious really with the world, to find that inner spark, to find that inner meaning. I want to really maybe dive away from the article, but more to your own adventures and fascinations, because you're a fellow reader and a fellow traveler.
Yeah, I mean,
what was it that you found fascinating in the Orient?
Yeah, well, again, it was all about people. I remember a guy in India, we were struggling to book an airline ticket, Romana and I, and an elderly gentleman, the same age as me, came in and he sort of fixed it in the internet cafe. And he fixed it, and I said, well, thank you. How much do I owe you? And he put his hand over his heart, the way people do in the East, and he said, you are our guests. And this warm feeling arose, you know, there was connection. I've no idea what religion he was, probably a Hindu, maybe a Catholic. There's lots of Catholics in India. But that was something beautiful. It was a nice feeling, you know, and those are my kind. Of course, there's the architecture, you know, and the paintings, and you know, and the poetry and all that stuff. But basically, it's connecting with the people. There was a guy in Kerala, we went in to buy souvenirs for the kids, and he had some nice stuff. And I said, how much is this piece? And he said, he gave me a price in rupees. And I said, oh no, that doesn't work. And so obviously I'm going to try and bargain with him. And he said, well, okay, how much do you want to pay? I said, no, you misunderstood me. You're not asking enough. And his jaw dropped, you see. So I started to laugh, and then he laughed, you know. And I said, you married? He said, yeah. Got kids? He said, yeah, 4 kids. I said, yeah, we got 4 kids. How's it going? He said, well, they need new school uniforms. And suddenly I wasn't a tourist with a guy in a souvenir shop. We were 2 old gentlemen talking about their kids and the problems of everyday life. This was contact with people, you know, and these are the kind of Oriental, and actually it could happen anywhere. I don't feel the difference between the Orient. Okay, the sun's always shining mostly, and okay, but that's superficial stuff. Somehow or other, the people are actually pretty similar to some people. I could have met that guy in London, you know, or in New York or wherever, you know, there would have been somebody like him. And I found that the Oriental thing, we went to the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha. That was sensational, fabulous. I mean, wonderful art, wonderful carpets, wonderful ceramics. And we went to that wonderful Persian restaurant in the Souq Waqif. Fabulous. You know. These are, unfortunately, I don't have any academic inclinations about these things. I've come to the point now where I think I know why people are the way they are. And it's basically their environment, their upbringing, and that's pretty ordinary stuff. People know that anyway. And I found that I just liked the people, you know. And of course, it was warm. Romana could go swimming every day. I mean, we loved all that, you know. But it was just the people, really.
Yeah, and it is.
And the Oriental travelers. I don't know. You know, I think the Oriental travelers were. I mean, Gertrude Bell and T. Lawrence. They did have a political angle, you know, they were into that. And of course there was Kipling, and he was political in his own socio-political way, you know, and all the other crowd, and everybody had their reasons for doing things, you know. But somehow or other, I get the feeling that right at the bottom of their lives, there's something else, something that motivates them, there's an inner spark You know, in the literature, I think it was Dante and George Bernard Shaw, people like that, they were already talking about it, the divine spark.
Yeah.
You know, they were already talking about God, but it wasn't in the way, because they were still sort of fumbling through the ideas. And then you've got Richard Dawkins, the atheist, you know, he talks about God and he denies God. But curiously, he uses the word God in denying God. You know, so it's I mean, it's sort of like
and readers will find in the article really a lot of these open-ended remarks and discussion points that I hope that will be provided just to spark that curiosity and interest to further read. And
I can only say I really enjoyed writing it, but that's what I do for enjoyment. You know. Yeah. It could be anything. I used to write for a jazz magazine, and I loved that too, you know, because I liked doing it. You know? And I can only appreciate that what all of you people are doing is really wonderful, you know.
We will enjoy continuing reading your work, hopefully. And just on that note, I'll pass on back to Hakan.
Okay, thanks for your time, Emma. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Lawrence and Mehmet. It was a lovely talk. Just to give you an idea about the spectrum of thought and readership that Lawrence is involved among the thousands of books he reads, this was one of those that he actually mailed me for me to read. This is Futuh al-Ghaib by Abdul Qadir Jilani, one of the giants of Islamic mysticism. So this is one particular book, probably 99% of Muslims never read, including myself. Before he talks about such a level of thought and consciousness and mystical faith, that this is where Lawrence is actually traveling. And I'm very grateful for his contributions to the Fountain with his beautiful sense of humor and refinements of literary quality that it brings to the magazine, to the journal. I really appreciate his work. And Mehmet, thank you very much for moderation. Mehmet joined us from London, and Lawrence was from Austria. So we're now moving on to our next session, to Scrap Paper Loves Me by Al Ozdogan. He's a very experienced teacher here in New Jersey. He will be moderated by Esra Eldem, who's an MA candidate and a research assistant at California State University, Long Beach, in the linguistics department. Esra, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yeşilova. So we'll discuss with Mr. Alpaslan Ozdogan about his article titled Scrap Paper Loves Me. So before we get started, let me briefly share Mr. Ozdogan's bio with you. Alpaslan Ozdogan has an international academic background with several years of teaching experience overseas and middle and high school math teacher in US public schools. He got his master's degree in math education at City University of New York, and he is currently a doctorate student at Seton Hall University. He's married and has 3 children. Mr. Ozdogan, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been an honor. Thank you for the opportunity.
So you wrote the article titled Scrap Paper Loves Me, where you speak about how seemingly small things that we normally take for granted in life, such as scrap paper, should be absolutely treasured. So I read your article and I'm so much inspired by that. So I'm curious to learn first, what made you write about a scrap paper? So what is the message that you wanted to give to the audience to this article?
Sure. As far as I know myself, I'm the scrap paper lover, or anything that makes our life easier. I'm the lover of those things, including this. And also, I'm lucky enough to be different part of the world as an educator, as a teacher. So it's hard to say. You cannot really avoid yourself from the papers because you are the teacher, we are educators. And got a chance to be in Azerbaijan for a couple of years as a teacher, where the scrap paper are so valuable, so precious. it's not all the family that are able to afford to buy, school supplies, including the papers, pencils. Versus in US, I've been in the classrooms for many years. I've experienced a cultural shock. Being in the classroom, end of each period, I was collecting the papers, pencils, even the worksheet they're given to the students, and you collect them, and then they don't really, care. And I don't want to say they're ignorant. It's about not, maybe we didn't educate them. We didn't really help our kids understand that they're so precious. They don't see the other side of the words, but now they've seen, I'm here, I have that experience, and I started seeing, that's really upsetting. I gotta do something for that. That's how I start my, kind of journey.
Yeah, definitely. So as you told before, you have experience in residing in Azerbaijan, where paper is given so much importance. So do you think the same value should be given to scrap paper here in the United States, where we may tend to consume a lot carelessly sometimes? So I'm also curious to learn if there's any global issue that you'd like to address with this article that you wrote.
I think this is already itself that we are not aware. It's already a global issue to me, because we are not good with the statistic. We live with the daily life, and we don't know how much we consume those stuffs. Even though we are aware, even we say we are in digital worlds. Right now we are using, the telephone, all kind of digital communication. However, in our families, from the paper towel, plates, paper napkins, everything became part of the life. So we cannot really, so we should know that. And when I look at it, I say, let me just look at some statistic. It was very, kind of fascinating number, at the same time, kind of scary numbers that I came up with. Let me just share a few of things with you. The American, they go through 15 million rolls of the toilet paper every year. That means that's enough to wrap around the globe 40 times. That's for every year. Yeah. Another statistic. An average of 300 million tons of paper is produced each year. And the average American one person consumes more than 700 pounds of the paper each year. Do you know how many trees we are killing each year? It's about 68 million trees are cut and down each year to produce paper. So those are kind of the part that we are right now that we are experiencing. This is a global issue. And we all should be responsible, accountable for this, starting from individual and then moving forward.
Yeah, definitely. So that's a very serious issue that addresses also like global warming. It's also related to that. So and your statements also, as well as your article, makes me think about how ignorant we human beings are, in that we tend to throw away the scrap papers. So considering the importance that you give to scrap papers, how valuable do you believe are the details that are seen minor from the majority perspective?
I think the part that we are missing the minor things. When we ignore the minor things, those minor things become the major issues. Then it's hard to deal with. And then it's not really easy. It's not really easy to expect the governments or an organization, they really take care of all the recycling. They kind of educate people. I think that starts from individual. I took that person, responsibility by myself. I said, I should be by myself, but I gotta do something for that. So then maybe something from the family, maybe from some other thing I could do. Then I said for my students, so at least for my family members, for my kids. So yes, they're ignorant. They are not appreciative about what really makes our life easier around us. Scrap paper is a symbolic. I love it. I cannot survive without it because I have to write it. Even if we have the cell phone and other things, I have to write things on it. But starting from papers, there are so many things that around us, I kind of value them. I kind of give them, they're kind of alive to me because they have a reason to be here. They have a reason to be, produced by humans, but they have a purpose. Then we need to value those things so we can be just not ignorant, be considerate of those stuff.
Definitely, definitely. So also the statements that you made also reminded me of my childhood memories where my dad would have us keep like separate piles of papers. So one for blank unused papers, and the other one for scrap papers, and one for colored papers maybe. So we would also use each one of them for different purposes. So do you also think, like, I know that you address this in your article too, if you make use of those scrap papers twice, the third time, etc., the scrap paper loves you, right? So I continue personally this habit of mine. Do you also think that scrap paper would love me as well?
I think definitely. Looks like you're one of the best candidates actually that you can. I think as far as I know myself, and with for many years, I was using every single paper. As a matter of fact, this is my examples. The one side, I'm not sure whether you can see it, is all my notes. Everything is written, all the printouts. My other side is here. I started with just piled one or two of them. Then I started I have tons of this. I tutor students, they come to me. My best gift for them is, I call them scrap paper notebook. They said, you never find this name in other places. If you go to the store, do not ask for scrap paper notebooks. Please, here it is. Take this, use it. Believe it or not, the next lesson when they come back, they're like, oh, Mr. Raz, I use them. I love it. I finish it. For some particular student, they said, do you have another one? Of course I have another one. And then if I'm kind of instill these positive things into their minds, I think then I do my job. Then one person from that family, they're gonna start using their scrap paper, they use it. My son comes to me saying that, oh, can we make a kite? I think my main thing is I give them blank paper. He asked me blank paper because it's in the printer. I was like, hey, use this one. Because this one is written, but it's good to go. Just use this one. My point is not just recycling piece of it. My point is let's use them effectively. When I was a student, I was writing every single inch of the paper is with my math problems or some writing on it. So those are really important things. I think you are a good candidate. I appreciate that we all on the same side, on the same page.
Glad to hear that. Yeah, definitely. So it's also very obvious that you not only teach math to your student, but also life lessons to them and values to our next generations as well. Yeah. Which is amazing. So from that, I continue to my final question, which is also related to it. Are there any suggestions that you'd like to give to our readers and our audience right now that are watching you through your article?
There are so many things in my mind. I'll keep it short. I think one thing that we have to really educate ourselves, definitely. We cannot be ignorant to the global issues. There should be some global awareness of this issue. That's stuff from the people's mind. That's stuff from me. That's right now probably from stuff from you guys as well. You're my listener right now. Probably whoever watching us too. I think that's first things. And then we have to really pay attention to the minor things. I will say probably like I did, just get a paper, staple them, put them aside. When the time comes, give someone to use or use by yourself. And maybe I'm so happy to see a lot of trend that's on the YouTube. They're talking about recycling, using just the natural resources instead of using the others, and use the art crafts. Anything you just pile up with your kids, do science projects, do some art craft project with your kids, and then maybe you can start some project too. Years ago, with an initiative or some friends, they collected a lot of pencils to send to in different around the world people they needed. Believe it or not, even myself in our family, I will say I have more than 200 to 300 just the pencils, either used, either new. It's there, and so that's the things. If you have to be aware of those things, I think we have to consider other people. They need it. They need more than us. So if we have that awareness, we're able to help other people. We can contribute it. It's less, but imagine those less get together. It's going to be a pile. So it's going to be the huge amount. And when we are able to actually, help people, help the students, the others, around the world, maybe they don't have that, opportunity as we do. I will just give you my final message that I put in my writing is, I said, if you and I dare to save scrap paper, probably scrap paper also be there to save you and I, that I put it. So that scrap paper symbolic, just everything that we care about us, we should. Hopefully they're saving us. They don't talk, but they save us too.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for such an insightful essay and nice conversation and great ideas, Mr. Ozdogan. So we appreciate it. Thank you
for having me. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, Esra and Al, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. Well, we're ending our event right now. I'm very thankful to everyone, all speakers, especially to Behzad and Professor Alam. I mean, we kept them awake this 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning. Very grateful for your participation. I'm grateful to Lawrence. He joined in Austria, and Mehmet from London. So Esra from Los Angeles and Al from New Jersey. So very appreciative of all your contributions. We look forward to your future contributions too to the fountain. And Jamal, could you please close out the event? I would like to see all of you again in our next event.
Thank you everyone so much for tuning in. If you're able to tune in live, we greatly appreciate it. And we hope to see you next time. To everyone watching, please consider following our social media accounts. We are very active on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and we post on a daily basis. We share relevant articles, we share insightful things, try to make positive postings, spread positive images, and to remind everyone of the themes that we try to convey. Also, please consider subscribing to the magazine. If you would like to receive 6 beautiful issues of the fountain, you can see an example behind Hakan previously. You will get it every 2 months, and you can see the whole articles in very good detail, very high quality. We also have all of our articles completely for free with no advertisements on our website if you just want to read anything at any time. So thank you everyone so much for tuning in, and we hope